One of the things that's universal among beings is that all beings want happiness, don't want suffering. This is a formula that the Dalai Lama uses. It's worth looking at what is meant by happiness and different kinds of happiness and how we go about finding happiness. There are a few different words in Pali that in different contexts are used to translate happiness or joy. There's the verb modati, which means to rejoice, and that has derivatives pamoja, which is happiness or joy, and that also occurs in the word anumodana. Pamoja occurs in the transcendental dependent arising, is the result of faith, happiness, pamoja. That word is also modati. Another derivative from it is mudita, which is the third Brahma Vihara, the one that is usually translated as sympathetic joy, which is the complementary opposite of compassion, karuna. In compassion, we wish that beings don't suffer, and with mudita, we wish that beings continue to enjoy the good fortune they have attained. So in the one we focus on the suffering aspect of beings, and in the other we focus on the joyful aspect of beings. Anumodana is rejoicing in the meritorious. The chant that we do at mealtime is an anumodana. The essence of the chant is to rejoice in the good fortune, that the good karma that has been made by those beings who have offered the food, prepared the food. And we're wishing, rejoicing in their merit. When we transfer merit to the departed, it works in this way, because one who's in the Peta realm, a ghost, has very little opportunity to make merit. But if you do a meritorious deed and wish that merit transferred to your relatives in the Peta realm, then in their realm they rejoice in that. And the act of rejoicing in merit is itself a karmically positive, meritorious act. Other two words that are often translated as happiness or joy are piti and sukha. These are both jhana factors. Piti, some translators prefer happiness, some prefer rapture. This also occurs as one of the 7 enlightenment factors, the bojjhanga. This is something that's worth remembering, that joy is an enlightenment factor. There's no benefit to gain from being miserable. Being joyous and happy brightens the mind, and the specific kind of happiness, piti, is classed as one of the enlightenment factors. Sukha is sometimes translated as bliss. It's the most general word, I would say, for happiness or joy. In its most rudimentary form, sukha simply means pleasant feeling. Sukha vedana, pleasant feeling, is sukha. The 3 feelings, dukkha, sukha, and neutral, which is adukkha, asukha, is the 3 vedana. So that's the most rudimentary form. It's just simply a feeling, pleasant feeling, and that might be very mild. It's on a spectrum from just mildly pleasant to ecstatically blissful. As a jhana factor, it has a different quality than piti. They're both present in a degree in first jhana. Then in second jhana, piti predominates. They're still both present, but then piti falls away, leaving only sukha in third jhana. The difference between the two is that piti is more energetic. There are different manifestations, different forms of piti. There's a list in the Visuddhimagga of different kinds of piti. It is a pleasant feeling, a thrilling, pleasant feeling. That's why it's sometimes called rapture. And it has usually a physical or bodily correlate that one feels like goosebumps or spine rushes. There's different manifestations of it. The highest form, the most sublime form of piti is they call uplifting piti, is a sensation of lightness in the body to such a degree one feels that one is lifting off the floor. It's a subjective feeling of floating or levitating. And if you experience this in meditation, it can be, if you experience it the first time, it can be so surprising that you might lose the meditation and open your eyes to see if you're actually floating. It's a subjective feeling. I'm not talking about an actual levitation. That's something else. But this is the highest form of piti, is this uplifting piti. Sukha is calmer, more expansive. It has no thrilling or exciting aspect to it. It's a kind of a oceanic feeling. So this is often translated as bliss in this context. And it has this quality of steadiness. In one sutta that talks about jhana, there are metaphors, and as we know, the Buddha was a master of metaphors, a metaphor for the different jhanas, focusing on these factors. The happiness that's experienced in first jhana is compared to the water that's mixed in with the bath powder. This is a little bit obscure. It's a reference to how they used to deal with bath soap in ancient India, to apparently mix a powder with water until you got a goopy mass to wash with. And just as the water permeates every part of the soap ball, so does the piti and sukha permeate every part of the meditator's body. One feels as piti and sukha. In the second jhana, it's compared to a mountain lake that has no rivers flowing into it and no rain falling onto it, but is continually refreshed from an underground spring. So this is a very interesting image, and the focus here is on piti, and you relate this to the uplifting feeling, the spine rushes, and the lifting, the lightness of the body. It's entirely internally generated is the key factor. I think there's a strong correlation here to what in other Indian traditions they talk about kundalini energy. I think is that piti is a correlate of that there's this internally generated kind of yogic energy or blissful sensation in the body that's internally generated. In third jhana, the piti falls away and the meditator is experiencing sukha. And the metaphor here is a lotus growing in a pond and not breaking the surface. So some lotuses break the surface and some don't. This one doesn't break the surface, so it's completely immersed from root to petal entirely in water, just as the meditator is entirely submerged in sukha. It's kind of important that these first three, all three of them use water as a part of the metaphor. The water permeating every particle of the soap ball, water uprushing in the mountain lake, and the lotus immersed entirely in water. And you notice that in the second jhana, the water is in motion, it's uprushing. And in the third jhana, it's still. The lotus is immersed in still water in a pond. By nature, it's not moving. It's not like a river. It's still pond. The fourth jhana is based on the quality of equanimity, upekkha, and this is the only one that doesn't use water. The image here is of a man covered in a very light cotton cloth from head to toe. And the cloth is so light that it clings to his body and covers every inch of his body. The being is completely immersed in the equanimity and the upekkha. There's also an analogy for second and third jhana with the appropriate Brahma gods. The second jhana level Brahma gods are called the Abhisara beings, and they're said to continually cry out, Aho Sukho, O the bliss. And this is said to be the most beautiful sound in the universe, hearing these choruses of Brahmas crying out, Aho Sukho. One of the characteristics of all Brahmas is a radiance, that they shine. And the radiance of Abhisara Brahmas flickers like a torch. There's the Subhakina Brahmas, third level, third jhana Brahmas. They don't cry out, they're silent. This is said to be the supreme happiness or the supreme bliss in all the universe. Is that experienced by Subhakina Brahmas. And their radiance does not flicker like a torch, but is continuous and steady. So all the fireworks is in the second Brahma level, in Piti, second jhana, and one is beyond that with third jhana. In one of the chants, one of the Parita chants, there's a line that says, may all beings enjoy the threefold bliss. And this refers to the bliss or the happiness, sukha, the word used is sukha. This refers to the happiness experienced from senses, the happiness experienced from jhana, and the supreme happiness of nibbana, which is the happiness beyond happiness. This is the threefold bliss, the threefold sukha. We could say that sukha in and of itself is always a good thing. It's always a positive factor. It's not the highest factor. In a kind of a hierarchy of states, upekkha, equanimity, is considered superior to sukha. It's the fourth jhana is beyond sukha, is based on upekkha. And also in the vipassana path, when one gets to the stage of equanimity about formations, this is the highest point one can reach by striving. It's the jumping off place for awakening, when one has a profound equanimity. But sukha, or happiness, is a positive. It's a significant detail one can get from study of the Abhidhamma, is correlating the feeling tone with the various mental states and factors. And this is something that Abhidhamma is well known for, is the various kind of tables of correlation. And any mental state that is associated with unhappiness, unpleasantness, domanassa, is always unskillful. Happiness can occur with skillful or unskillful states, but there's no skillful state that is associated with unhappiness. So there's no benefit to be gained from unhappiness. Some people take that kind of in the wrong way. The point is not to punish yourself. Some people are just gluttons for punishment, and they use it as just another stick to beat themselves with. Oh, well, I'm unhappy, I must be a bad person. That's not the meaning of it. It's to recognize and understand your mental states. And until you are fully liberated, there will be unhappiness. And it's not to say that unhappiness is generating any bad karma. It's a resultant of bad karma. But the way to use that teaching skillfully is to recognize it when it occurs and not to let yourself validate it and wallow in it. Recognize, oh, this is unhappiness. This is not a good thing. I don't need to be here. So the first kind of happiness, and the one that is most sought after generally in the world, is the happiness based on the senses. Any experience of pleasant objects through the senses is a result of good karma. This is how karma works. A skillful action done in the past will yield pleasant results in the future. Unskillful act in the past will lead to unpleasant results in the future. So there's nothing ethically either good or bad about pleasant sense experience. It's a resultant. It's just as it is. The danger, and the Buddha talked about sense pleasures in terms of gratification and danger. There's the gratification. There is a happiness that comes from pleasant sense objects, pleasant sight, sounds, tastes, touches. That there is a pleasantness. That's the reward. That's the satisfaction. But the danger is that one craves them and acts in unskillful ways to acquire them or keep them. There's one sutta that lists a long list of dangers that are associated with sense pleasures. And seeking out sense pleasures, beings create crimes and robberies, and then they're captured by the king and tortured and impaled on stakes. Having acquired sense pleasures, one then feels obligated to protect them from rain and fire and greedy relatives and kings. Robbers, greedy relatives, and kings. so when you have more worldly goods, you have more security issues, in modern parlance. You have more problems defending, protecting what you've got. The list even includes, on account of sense pleasures, beings strap on armor and take up sword and spear and go to war and battle with each other, which is a kind of an interesting addition to the list. It's like the Buddha's speaking about a kind of economic basis of warfare. The reason beings go to war is not sort of honor or glory. It's sort of acquiring sense pleasure. Take over the oasis from the other tribe or so on. And the satisfaction that comes from happiness from sense pleasures is limited in that, in the first place, it's dependent. It's dependent on external objects. One must have the access to the desired objects of the sense in order to experience the happiness, the pleasure. So it's dependent. So in some way or another, it's going to take effort to acquire and keep. And it's unreliable and uncertain, in that even one acquires the desired object, it's subject to loss in various ways, and all conditioned things are impermanent, so eventually there will be a separation from it. And separation from the desired is one of the causes of unhappiness. There was I can't remember who it was. It was one of the royal women, a princess or a queen, who, in dialogue with the Buddha, mentioned how much she enjoyed her children, and she said, I wish I could have 1,000 children. And the Buddha thought, this was a really foolish sort of desire. And he said, how many children every day in this city die from disease or want or whatever? And she says, well, there's always it's a big city. There's always some death in the city. So if you had 1,000 children, you'd be constantly mourning the death of one or the other of them. So the more you have pleasant desired objects, the more you're going to experience loss. Superior to the pleasures of the senses is the happiness found internally from the jhanas, as they are internally generated. They're not dependent on external objects, and they're not without falling away or loss, but they can be very much longer lasting and persisting. There's a sutta where the Buddha encounters a naked ascetic who's practicing various kinds of self-torture. This was one of the things that was done in ancient India, and still actually is today, the self-mortification. And this particular fellow was practicing standing practice, never sitting down or lying. And he had like a lot of these ascetics. They never cut their hair. He had really long, shaggy hair. And at night, when he was time to sleep, he would take his hair and tie it in the branch of a tree so that he wouldn't fall down while he slept. So the Buddha said, what is the result of this constant standing practice? And he said, terrible aching, racking pains in my entire body constantly, continually. And the Buddha said, what's the point of that? He says, because this is burning up all of my old bad karma. The way that they understood karma to work, as the Buddha then critiques him in various ways, that he's actually making more bad karma by causing himself to suffer. It's not doing any good. And the Buddha then talks about his own practice, which includes the jhanas. And this fellow then scoffs and he says, are you telling me that happiness comes from happiness? When happiness only comes from pain. And if happiness came from happiness, then King Bimbisara of Magadha would be an arahant, because he's constantly surrounded by the pleasures of the senses. Bimbisara was the king of Magadha, and he was a good, noble king, but he also had a reputation for sensuality, a big harem and lots of soft cushions, and all this Indian opulence and luxury. And the Buddha said, can King Bimbisara sit without moving, wrapped in the highest bliss continually for 14 days at a time? Because I can do that. This is the pleasure of the jhana transcends even this kind of proverbial, the highest, the most happiest, pleasant physical sense pleasure existence of the time was Bimbisara. He would be sort of the model of it. It doesn't get any better than Bimbisara for ancient India. And the Buddha is saying, well, he can't. His happiness pales. In terms of enjoyment of sense pleasures, another issue is that they're insatiable, that there's no possibility of satisfying sense desire. And there's a Jataka story that illustrates this. It was one of the wheel-turning monarchs, Makadeva, who, after conquering the whole earth, the 4 continents, which is as far as most wheel-turning monarchs ever get, and he was living at a time when human lifespan was very long. He was enjoying this pleasures of ruling the world for several thousand years. Then he became dissatisfied, and he asked one of his counselors, is there any place better than the earth for sense pleasures? And he said, yes, there's the realm of the 4 great kings on the slopes of Sinnaru. So he says, right, saddle up, boys, and got the army going, and they swarmed up the side of Sinnaru. Wheel-turning monarchs, a characteristic of them is that they conquer without shedding blood. Everywhere they go, this wheel appears in the sky, and the enemies fall down prostrate in awe of the wheel. They submit to the will of the king. So the 4 great kings surrendered their kingdom to this wheel-turning monarch, and he sat on the throne in the realm of the 4 great kings. And then he ruled there for several thousand years. Then he grew dissatisfied again, and he asked, well, where is there even higher sense pleasures than this? And they told him Tawatingsa heaven at the top of the mountain. So he goes up there with his army and his wheel, and Saka, the king of the gods, gives him half of Tawatingsa to rule. And half the deities are now under his power. So he rules side by side with Saka for several thousand years, and he grows dissatisfied again, and he hatches a plot to kill Saka and take over the whole works. And as soon as he has this evil thought, he loses all his power and glory, and he falls to the earth. And he's lying there dying in the garden of the palace, and they ask him if he has any last words to pass on to the people, and he says, yes, I've conquered the whole world and ruled in heaven, and still I was not satisfied. Truly, sense pleasures are without satisfaction. And this story is used to illustrate the impossibility of satisfying sense pleasures. Whatever you get, you're going to want more. What's just out of reach seems like the most tantalizing, most wonderful thing, that I'll be so happy if I just get that. And then you get it, you're happy for a little while, and then you feel dissatisfied, you want something else. And even if you could take over the whole earth, all the four continents and the realms of the gods, you would still not be satisfied. So there's no peace, no possibility of completion or satisfaction within the sense desire realm. And the happiness, it is real happiness there, but it's fleeting and it's impermanent, and it doesn't satisfy the mind. The experience of the jhanas, one is then, for the time being, while one is in that state, one has transcended the sense sphere. So there's a greater peace and satisfaction. And there isn't this longing, nagging for the next thing. That's why the 5 hindrances that prevent the mind from coming into deep samadhi pretty well revolve around, one way or the other, revolve around sense, addiction to the sense sphere. Sense desire is one of them, and ill will is another, and worry, uddhacca kukkacca, is worry. These are all having to do with the objects of the senses. And when the 5 hindrances are not present, then the mind is naturally gravitates towards the samadhi and jhana. But it's a removal from the sense desire realm. That's the critical thing. You know, people think there's no way I could give up my pleasant sense experiences. This comes largely from not being able to imagine or having experienced anything else. When you were a little child, you probably had a favorite toy, and you couldn't imagine living without it. You know, your stuffed bunny or your red truck. You know, there's no way you could possibly live for a day without this. I mean, now you can't even remember it, or you certainly don't want it, or could spend hours playing with it. But at that moment, at that time, you couldn't imagine being separated from it. You couldn't imagine how terrible, horrible life would be if you lost your fluffy bunny. That would just be unbearable. One of the Buddha's strongest analogies for sense pleasures is the leper in the marketplace. He's talking about, he says, monks, you've seen this leper that sits in the marketplace begging. He's covered in sores, weeping sores, and he has a little brazier of hot coals that he keeps beside him. And every now and again, with a pair of tongs, he'll take out one of these red-hot coals and press it into one of his open sores. And this gives him temporary relief. It cauterizes the wound and stops the oozing, and feels momentarily better. He said, do you think if that leper could be miraculously cured and walk away clean and whole, do you think he would even once reminisce and miss the pleasure he got from his hot coals? Would he be nostalgic about his hot coals? He says this is like sense pleasures. The weeping sores are like the sense organs, and the hot coals are like the desired objects that we use to momentarily solve the aching of the sense organs for desires for pleasure. And if we could get beyond sensuality, we would not for one moment be nostalgic about it, because we'd have gone to something superior. Yeah. But the pleasures of the jhana realms are superior to that of the sense desire realm, but are themselves impermanent and subject to falling away and not perfect. Yeah? So there's the third of the threefold bliss, is the bliss beyond bliss. It's not even really proper to call it bliss. It's beyond that altogether, is the realization of nibbana. That's the only safe, secure refuge of all beings, the realization of the unconditioned. It's getting beyond all of it, getting beyond the formless form and sense objects. This constitutes a threefold bliss. And I think it's important, for practice, for daily life and understanding, to have a proper understanding and attitude towards this idea of the gratification, danger, and escape inherent in sense pleasures. I think there's a danger of misunderstanding or mishearing, not taking these teachings properly. And the people either they hear which is a very common refrain of the Buddha's warning about the dangers of sense desire, and they either don't want to hear it and they reject it out of hand, or they take it the wrong way and develop a kind of swing to the opposite extreme, a kind of a self-mortification, or at least a extreme asceticism or austerity. It's important to understand that sense pleasure in itself is not ethically wrong. The Buddha would sometimes use the phrase, and when talking to lay people, go ahead, enjoy, when he's finished the discourse, and this person's leaving, he says, go good man and enjoy lawful sense pleasures. As long as the sense pleasures are obtained in a way that's not contrary to the precepts, they're not in themselves ethically wrong. But to understand the limitation of them, the danger inherent in them, and to see it, and the nuances in sense pleasure is also something I think that's evident in the cosmological picture of the various sensual heavens, the sagas. The bottom ones is sort of like the lowest sensual heavens are sort of like party around the clock. It's like the sort of the things you would imagine as being pleasant on earth, but multiplied endlessly. But then it gets more and more refined and subtle as you go, until the highest sense desire realms is like just appreciation of beauty. And then it's less of a stretch to go then from that state to the Brahma gods that are beyond sensuality, that don't take any pleasure, don't seek out pleasure or experience pleasure through the senses, but internally generated. And I think you see this with any kind of ordinary human sense pleasures, that there are gradations, there's subtleties. Food is a good example. There's different ways of enjoying food, and food is certainly a sense pleasure. The two sort of extremes or sort of categories of indulging sense pleasures in food is, gluttony and the connoisseur, right? It's like either just consuming mass quantities. The fattier, the sweeter, the greasier, the better. Just you know, consuming mass quantities. That's one end of it. The other end is being a connoisseur of fine tastes and flavors and so on. This is like a different level of sensuality. It's usually with things like music too. So many different styles of music, and some styles of music appeal to a kind of more animal nature, like the rhythm, the beat, and is the predominant characteristic. And then you have more refined melodic sorts of music until you get to some of the classical music, like particularly Bach, where it's almost transcending sensuality. It becomes like a mental, intellectual game to try and follow the complex counterpoints in the rhythm and the melody. And this corresponds to the different levels of the heavens. The sense pleasure gets gradually refined until it refines itself out of existence. They transcend, get beyond sensuality. Then you go through the various jhana states, or the cosmological equivalent to Brahma realms, and they become increasingly refined, increasingly subtle, from the piti to sukha to upekkha, equanimity. And at each stage, you're shedding things, you're losing layers of complication, of variation, and seeking a more kind of primordial simplicity of mind. And the happiness becomes more profound, more real, more long-lasting, until you transcend even the idea of happiness and the happiness beyond happiness, and realize the unconditioned. That any of this is, you transcend all of it, even the most subtle, most refined.